Is that going to be?
When US President Barack Obama flew to Cuba to re-establish diplomatic relations, Ben Rhodes was there.
You know Mr. Rhodes?
He wasn't just another face in the line, he was one of the key negotiators. It's a sign of how important and trusted he'd become within the Obama White House. He first started working with the Obama campaign in 2007 as a speechwriter. Over the years, he became a significant voice, not just in crafting the message, but in actually shaping US foreign policy, and was the man who directed the media operation to sell the Iran nuclear deal to a skeptical American public. There are those who suggest that while he doesn't think for the president, he knows what the president is thinking. And as he now prepares to leave the White House for an incoming administration, it's clear that Ben Rhodes, as he talks to Al Jazeera, is not ready to stop thinking or worrying. Well, let's talk about Afghanistan. Was it a mistake saying that you were going to scale back the American presence there and giving a timescale for it?
I don't think so, because if you look at what worked in Afghanistan and what didn't, we did the surge, and that did enable us to accomplish some things. It enabled us to have a counterterrorism platform that could steadily degrade al-Qaeda in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. It enabled us to set up Afghan security forces and train them and move them into the lead. What it wasn't doing is, changing the nature of Afghan society. The surge in southern Afghanistan could clear out, Taliban militants for a period of time, but we can't build the economic and political structures that come in behind that. And an open-ended U.S. military presence that has that wider mission, I don't think would have yielded a better result in Afghanistan. And so this president's always been very clear, what can we achieve militarily and what can we not achieve?
But then there are many independent observers who say that ISIL has now got a foothold in Afghanistan. The Taliban is expanding its training network. Has this all been a waste of time over the last 8 years? Should the troops have remained there in large enough numbers to try and stop what was the initial mission, which was al-Qaeda getting a foothold in the country again?
What the president was always very candid about is we're not going to eliminate the Taliban. The Taliban is a political and military movement inside of Afghanistan. It's going to have to be dealt with militarily over time by Afghan security forces and hopefully politically through some reconciliation process. And if we had defined for ourselves the goal of defeating the Taliban, I think we would have been setting an unachievable goal that would have just led to a constant application of U.S. military resources in perpetuity.
Is the president guilty of what Robert Gates accused him of, one of his defense secretaries, by saying he was committed to the troops but not entirely committed to the mission?
No, because I think he defined the mission narrowly. I also think President Obama, he doesn't beat his chest. He doesn't take pleasure in the fact that we have to use military force. And I think that that's a better approach. I think that if you're too enthusiastic in the application of military power, that's when you overreach. And that's.
But did he go the other way by trying to get too many troops out too quickly then?
I don't think so. Look, I think some of this was a very necessary course correction from 7 years of the war under the Bush administration, because you also have to remember that for all of our military might in the United States, we cannot sustain that degree of deployment. I mean, we were spending $10 billion a month in Iraq. We were losing 100 people at the height of the war. You can't do that for 20 years. And so we had to scale back. And frankly, the American public had an expectation that we were going to scale back. And sustainability has always been a concern of the president's on our counterterrorism and war efforts. Let's not, he didn't want to leave his successor, for instance, with what he found, which is 180,000 troops and this massive resource allocation.
Was that then what was in the back of his mind when Syria arose? The fact that he didn't want to commit in the same sort of level because he wanted it to be something that could be sustainable and not hand his successor a Middle East disaster?
It was part of it. I think another part of it that is less fully understood and appreciated is that he never felt like he saw a military option that worked. I mean, he's used military force. He sent troops to Afghanistan his entire presidency. He's used force in Libya, in Somalia, in Yemen. But in Syria, there was never a military option that he could see beyond the first move. If we bomb runways, Assad's still there. They're rebuilding the runways. What do you do next? if we take out Assad, there's a vacuum, and there's still ISIL and Hezbollah, and Iran is still involved, and Russia is still backing maybe proxies in the former regime, and that's still a war, and that's still a humanitarian catastrophe. And then do we get more drawn in?
Well, given that knowledge, was it a mistake then to issue the red line? To say that if he doesn't stop using chemical weapons, then we're going to do something about it?
I don't think so, for the simple fact that, for all the messiness of that, that did lead to the removal of a lot of chemical weapons.
Didn't stop them though.
Well, it didn't stop the initial use, but they had a massive chemical weapons infrastructure. Just imagine Syria today, or over the last several years, with all of that still in place. It would be a risk of falling in the hands of ISIL. You'd see broader chemical weapons used by the Assad regime. We were able to remove them diplomatically. Now, I do think that the way in which it all played out was messy. The way in which our Congress was clearly backing away from the authorization, the way in which Russia kind of assumed this prominent role around the removal, certainly had negative appearances that we hear about to this day. But if you just look at the basic policy objective, the objective of the red line was to prevent the further use of chemical weapons. And we were able to remove, to go from a place where Syria didn't even acknowledge they had a chemical weapons program to the verified removal of a significant amount of their chemical weapons infrastructure. I think that has saved lives and prevented proliferation of chemical weapons.
So what's the difference between using chemical weapons in August 2009 and using chemical weapons in December 2016?
Well, I think what you see is a number of things since the sarin attack that prompted the whole removal of their chemical weapons infrastructure. What we've seen them do frequently with reported uses of chemical weapons is they use chemicals like chlorine that are not prohibited chemical weapons agents, so they weren't a part of the infrastructure that was taken out of the country. They're still lethal. But we were enforcing the very specific chemical weapons norm about removing things like sarin gas that are covered under that, under the Chemical Weapons Convention. I think what the difference is that this regime is so brutal that they will seek to find any weapon of war, be it a barrel bomb or a chlorine, to kill people. We were able to remove a significant proliferation risk, a weapon of mass destruction through their declared chemical weapons program. What that did is prevent them from having the most lethal weapon in their arsenal. What it didn't do is change the fact that this is a regime that kills civilians.
Did it weaken the United States by issuing a red line and then not following up, even when you could see that chlorine was being used? It's still a chemical weapon, still killing innocent civilians in the streets of Syria.
Well, look, I think you're dealing with choices. Had we bombed Syria over the use of their chemical weapons, we could not have destroyed the chemical weapons militarily. You actually cannot bomb. And this is one of the complicated things we were dealing with. You can't bomb chemical weapons stocks because then you put those into the atmosphere, or you get rid of the protections and actors on the ground can try to seize them. So we actually couldn't destroy it militarily. We were able to much more efficiently remove the chemical weapons without doing that. The question is, how would the United States have been weakened by, getting drawn into the war in Syria? Because, I think what the president saw is, well, if we bomb Syria over the use of chemical weapons, that is a military confrontation with the Assad regime, without domestic authorization, without international authorization, without any kind of clear plan as to what comes next. And inevitably, that would draw us in further because Assad would be there, he would still be attacking civilians, and frankly, once the United States gets involved in a conflict, you tend to see it through. And so, you have to weigh this against the alternatives. The United States being fully involved and on the ground in the war in Syria, with the war continuing and a huge vacuum, as against what we were able to accomplish, removing chemical weapons. Either of those are going to have pitfalls, problems for the United States, but ultimately another full-scale war in the Middle East that is going to be messy, that has no clear end, that would kind of consume the foreign policy of the United States, I think in the long run that would have done more to weaken the United States.
Do you think you were weakened by the fact you emboldened Vladimir Putin, who thought the Americans will make threats and they won't follow through in them?
No, because I think that, I really think that the Putin, the Putin policy of seeking to recover Russia's lost glory and being willing to cross red lines, I think that was, that's been part of a play that's been building for years. I don't think that a careful analysis of Russia's actions under Putin suggests that he just arrived at this agenda after the chemical weapons incident. I mean, I think we've seen him steadily over time, dating all the way back to actions in Chechnya and Georgia and Abkhazia, become more and more aggressive in trying to reassert, Russian authority, particularly in areas, that were, in his view, in their sphere. And so, one of the things about Syria and Ukraine is these are not, new areas that Putin is pushing into. He's actually expending resources and fighting to hold on to what had been Russian clients. So he felt Assad slipping away and has been heavily involved to prop him up. He felt Ukraine shifting to the west, and so he made his move in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So they're actually defensive maneuvers by Putin, albeit ones in which he's being very aggressive and crossing all kinds of international norms.
Back in the election campaign of 2012, Mitt Romney said that Russia was America's biggest geopolitical foe, and people in this administration and the president ridiculed him for that. Did he see things more clearly than the Obama White House? Well,
I've thought about that question, and I think, at that time, that was not our analysis. At that time, geopolitically, we saw the biggest threat as the terrorist threat. I think in the long term, in terms of American security policy, China is going to be a much more powerful country than Russia. So China takes up a lot of our attention. Not that they have to be a foe per se, but there's certainly massive competitive elements in the U.S.-China relationship. And in 2012, I don't think we'd seen Putin, fully press the envelope as far as he has today. But I think that clearly that has been the case in our second term. So I think, geopolitically, Russia is posing an enormous threat to the international order, and in that regard, I think the voices of skepticism and concern about Russia, can say, we have to recognize that they're a threat to the entire national order. Now, I still think to this day, and you can see this a little bit even in what's taken place, that again, Russia poses this immediate threat to kind of international order and stability. China is a much more powerful country and is much more positioned to be a competitor to the United States in a way that Russia can't. I mean, Russia's economy is a fraction of the size of ours and China's. Russia is a nuclear power and a power that asserts itself through aggression, particularly in its own neighborhood. But China is a country that is truly going to play the role of a world power. So I think long term, we'd make a mistake to take our eye off of that longer term competition that has been emerging. And I think we'd also make a mistake to turn that into confrontation by picking fights over issues related to Taiwan or territorial disputes.
But do you pick fights with Vladimir Putin because he interferes in US presidential politics?
Well, I think what you try to do is you try to shore up, first of all, the international environment so that there's more checks on Russian aggression. And we've tried to do that through the sanctions we've imposed over Ukraine, for instance. And I do think that their involvement in our election suggests a new reality where they're willing to violate established practices and respect for sovereignty in ways that we're going to have to change our practices. It's one thing, nations have been committing espionage for years. It's not a new thing for Russia to be even hacking into our systems. It's a new thing for them to be then disseminating that information publicly to achieve an effect, right? And I think that is tied to Russia's behavior and to the whole issue of cyber, where there are, countries have so much information and businesses and individuals online that it's going to involve us having much stronger cyber defenses, hopefully having more established international rules around cybersecurity, and yes, punitive costs for countries like Russia that violate those norms.
So there's got to be some sort of sanction against Vladimir Putin and Russia because of the involvement in the election?
Yeah, I think there has to be a response that demonstrates that we know what happened and that there are consequences for what happened, and importantly that going forward.
But is that a fight you really want to pick? Because they can retaliate, and as we saw, the lines that they deal in, as you say, are blurred. They don't deal with what has been diplomatically normal in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like a boxer fighting an ultimate fighting championship contestant. Russia is willing to, is not going to play by the rules, right? And you have to adjust to that reality. But I think that the reason you have to respond is because this could happen again. Everybody tends to look at one event in isolation. Well, Russia has shown that it will meddle in European elections. What's to stop Russia from meddling in our next congressional election or our next presidential election? And so if we're not demonstrating that every action will have a reaction now, it only emboldens Russia to take further actions going forward. And also part of what we need to do by putting information out is educating not just the American people, but publics in other countries like Europe. Here's what you need to look for. This is the dissemination of fake news or the dissemination of hacked information. When you see that happening in your country, you should think this is probably Russia. And we're already seeing indications in Germany, for instance, that they may be seeking to influence Angela Merkel's election. Well, the German public should know how to contextualize information, and the German government has already said it's going to have to take steps to try to protect against that.
You talked about China being a much bigger country and therefore perhaps something that the US should concentrate more on. Are you concerned about the military expansion by China in the South China Seas and the incident just a few days ago when one of your drones was taken out of the water by the Chinese?
I am concerned about it. And, I always felt like the South China Sea was going to be an issue that the next administration was going to have to really focus on. Because China has kind of crossed a threshold of military capability wherein their long-standing territorial claims are now being backed up by the building of structures or the more aggressive deployment of military resources. And this is an incredibly resource-rich environment that the global economy depends upon. The claims are so wildly divergent that there's all kinds of risk for escalation with a Vietnam or Philippines or Malaysia or Japan. This is a part of the world where the United States has been an anchor of stability and has a lot of military activity. So I think we need to find a stable equilibrium where China plays a role that it's going to have to play as a big and powerful country, but is not able to run roughshod over smaller countries in pursuit of its own claims.
As far as lasting legacy is concerned, do you see Cuba being a lasting legacy then? And what was the driver behind the decision to change 50 years of American foreign policy there?
I think Cuba is very much a legacy because it's very much an Obama initiative, putting the past behind us, reaching out to old adversaries. The driver was that this policy made no sense, and the only reason we continued to have it was because that was how we always did things. There was no result from that policy that was positive. It was hurting the Cuban people, not helping them. I think why it's so important, though, is it's bigger than just Cuba. In Cuba, obviously, I hope the opening continues and broadens in ways that help the Cuban people. But it's also about Latin America. Cuba was symbolic of a legacy where we overthrew governments and told people what to do, and there was always massive mistrust in Latin America. And this was a driver for the policy.
Is that a concern for you then as you come to your final days in the White House, that things like Cuba and the Iran deal and the stance you've taken on China will all be undone after January 20th and the next president of the United States is sitting in the White House?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a concern. We believe that the results speak for themselves and that these are the right approaches. On the Iran deal, there are horrible consequences of tearing up the deal. The United States would be isolated. We'd have trouble enforcing sanctions on Iran, because why would other countries cooperate with us after we blew up a deal that we negotiated? The Iranians might restart their program. There could be another conflict. So, I think we want to make sure the new administration is thinking hard about this. Now, part of what they need to understand is that these are international agreements largely. So the Paris deal, and Iran in particular, there are 200 countries in the Paris deal. There's 6 world powers in the Iran deal. It's not our decision alone to make. And frankly, I'm confident, for instance, about Paris more than anything else, because that's the framework to deal with climate change. We worked with the world to get everybody on board with it. The incoming administration could set back the pace at which we're meeting our targets, but climate change isn't going away, and I think we'll get to our targets one way or another, even if that means we have to take corrective action, frankly, when the political system and pendulum swings back. The Iran deal is the only way to solve the Iranian nuclear program diplomatically, something of that nature. So I think we've demonstrated here are the approaches that work. Cuba concerns me personally because I worked on it so long. There too, though, the thing that gives me hope is just the public opinion in the United States is so overwhelmingly in favor. We had a recent poll that said over 75% of Americans favor the opening to Cuba. So there are checks on how much can be undone, but hey, you got 8 years in these jobs and you do what you can, and there's a next administration coming in. And again, my hope is they keep doing what we're doing, and my expectation is, even if they undo some things, and the pivot to Asia is a good example of this, we're going to have to come back to that policy, because that's the only way, I think, to structure American engagement in the Asia Pacific, which is going to be a defining region of this century.
I know time is tight, Ben, but there is one question I wanted to ask you. Do you think Americans feel safer now than they did 8 years ago when Barack Obama took office? He said just a few days ago that there has been no large-scale military attack since 9/11, yet people have died in Orlando and they've died in San Bernardino, and people are scared. Do you think they're safer now?
I very strongly believe that they are safer now. As someone who worked with the 9/11 Commission, the real grave catastrophic risk of terrorism is something that is a complex operation, that is planned, that can take out critical infrastructure. We have decimated the infrastructure of organizations that were carrying out complex plots like that. The President's point was that no foreign terrorist organization has directed and carried out an attack in the United States. What we have seen are these lone extremists or homegrown extremists like Boston and San Bernardino, which are actually on the scale of the types of shootings that we see in the United States, where we've shown a great deal of resilience. What concerns me is that the American people, that the nature of our political and media culture is such that an individual event that does not threaten the existential nature of the United States is almost treated in that manner. In other words, terrorism is described by some of our critics as an existential threat to the United States. That's just not the case. The San Bernardino gunman can do awful things, like the Newtown gunman did. He cannot destroy the United States of America, and our way of life. And I do worry that the way in which we react to these lone wolf attacks is of such a different scale as to how we react to similar violent acts or tragic events, and that risks overreaction. That's what the terrorists want. They want us to overreact, to overextend ourselves abroad, to change our own democracy in ways that show that the United States is not this beacon of hope in the world. And that's why the President's had a very important line in that speech that he gave in Tampa. Terrorists cannot destroy our way of life, but we can do it for them if we react out of fear. And so I believe we're safer, but I worry that there's still this element in our politics and our media that sometimes inflates the threat in ways that lead to poor decision making.
Ben Rhodes, thank you very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera.
Good talking.